excited about our next guest, who is coming directly today from Washington, D.C. to share her expertise with us. I'm talking about Olivia Byrne, who is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office and a member of K&L Gates Real Estate Investment, Development, Sports, and Finance Group. Olivia is a leading member of the firm's U.S. economic incentives practice, along with the real estate and public finance practices in the Washington, D.C. office. She has successfully obtained significant economic incentives for clients on a national basis and has extensive experience drafting legislation for economic incentives and tax-related issues. Her practice involves site location for many different industries, namely technology, broadcasting, distribution centers, fulfillment centers, data centers, professional sports stadiums and arenas, practice fields, wood-based products and biofuels, industrial manufacturing, food processing, auto parts and components, as well as financial services, entertainment facilities, and hotels. She covers the entire gamut of cross-industry like most of you in our audience today represent. She and her team represent inbound companies from abroad, including Asia, Europe, and Canada, as well as U.S. companies relocating or deciding to remain in place and expand. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave you in the capable hands and leadership of Olivia Byrne. I'm very excited about your presentation. Thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us, Olivia.
Thank you. Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're excited to talk to you about economic incentives and site location, whether you are abroad and looking at coming to the U.S. or you're in the U.S. and looking at expanding or moving somewhere else within the United States for your facilities. Next slide, please. Next slide. Sorry about that. There we go. Great. So when do you begin? If you're interested in obtaining incentives and you want to maximize your incentives in the US, when do you begin the process? I always ask this question. And this is probably the most important thing you'll learn from me talking today is this particular slide. Although it looks so simple, it's not really so simple. You want to try to start working on economic incentives in the US as early as possible. You particularly want to do that before you sign a purchase agreement or a lease. If I frequently will, unfortunately, will get calls saying, I just signed the purchase agreement or I just executed the lease, let's get going on incentives. At that point, you have lost your leverage and it's probably too late to get many, many incentives. You may qualify for some, but you will lose the benefit of many incentives you could have qualified for. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what projects qualify for incentives in the United States. I've listed some, there's many others, just to give you an idea. So many of you are probably interested in data centers, definitely qualify, and it will vary from state to state. Manufacturing facilities, new headquarters projects, mergers and acquisitions can result in new sites as well as expansions, equipment purchases. We also work with mixed-use projects, relocation, and modernization projects. All of those can qualify for economic incentives throughout the United States. We work throughout the United States on a national basis. New slide, please. So the next question I'm asked is, well, what companies can qualify? What types of industries can qualify? Do I qualify for incentives? Just we're talking on a general basis. So I gave you a slide showing many different types of industries that we work with or that can qualify. Everything from aerospace, automotive, to technology, semiconductor plants, as well as, of course, data centers, and then heavy manufacturing, whether it's paper mills, auto suppliers, or others that are creating equipment in manufacturing facilities. All of those can qualify for incentives, as well as an office headquarters. I have a picture of an office on the slide. So those can qualify as well, even though they're not manufacturing anything, but it is a new headquarters project. So we've worked with many of those as well. New slide. New slide, please. These are the states we've worked a lot in. There's other states, of course, but you can see a wide range of states. And I wanted to show you this because each state has different requirements and provides slightly different incentives and has slightly different processes. So it's really important that you understand in the particular state that you're working on, what the process is, what incentives are available, who can qualify, how much can you qualify, and how does their process work, and what's the timing on their process, and how do you file the applications. Like some states have requirements that you really should be filing the applications for incentives prior to signing the purchase agreement, such as Tennessee likes to see that done, where other states are not as particular with regard to that. Next slide, please. So the economic incentives can also be used. We frequently work with companies abroad coming into the US. They would like their manufacturing facilities or data centers to qualify for economic incentives, which is great. Though they will be, as long as they're creating a lot of jobs, they will be welcomed into the states typically that we're applying to. And then they can establish their new business, or they could also be just expanding a business that they already have in the US and still receive economic incentives. Next slide, please. So economic incentives can be for, as we talked about, for companies coming in from Asia, Australia, Europe, Middle East, or those expanding in North America or coming in from South America. We've worked with many publicly traded companies as well as private companies, does not matter, US trade associations, and also global funds. Next slide, please. So then another question you might be thinking is, okay, I qualify, I'm expanding, I'm creating jobs. What kind of incentives might I receive in the United States? And again, it will really depend on your particular factual circumstance and which states that you're interested in going to. But I just put up a couple examples so you could see that we go after both what's called statutory incentives and discretionary incentives. So statutory is kind of by right, by statute. Discretionary would mean, as it says, it's at the discretion of the state or county that you could get additional incentives. Some of the examples are cash grants, tax abatements, tax credits, infrastructure. We can have a large amount of incentives coming in from help with the infrastructure, everything from roads, sewer lines, all of that for some of our projects. Land, sometimes we're able to obtain free land for our client for their manufacturing facilities in the US, depending on the state. Again, that's more discretionary, that's not statutory. Cost write-down, there's also utility rate incentives that you should be aware of. People forget that that's an option for many projects, as well as job training and job training credits. Some of the states have gotten quite creative with job training, and we were on a tour for a client coming in from Asia last week in Ohio, and they actually now have created a van, a big, huge bus van that will pull up in front of the corporation, and that is done by the state, and they will interview potential candidates for your jobs and screen them right outside your building, and do that to help the companies coming in from abroad or from another state to help provide the labor they need for these facilities. So they've gotten quite creative in the US in that area. Next slide, please. When you are trying to decide where to go, it's important to talk with the state and local officials. We always talk with them, look at what the clients are looking for in terms of a site. And it's also helpful typically if you are looking at more than one state to let them know that this is kind of a competitive process. And many times we are offered sites by states and counties without a real estate broker being involved, because they prefer to work directly with us and our clients so that there's not a brokerage fee involved, so that they can work directly with the client. Next slide, please. So then the other thing, what you want to ask, what are the cities and the states and the counties looking at? Like, how do I know that my project will be a good fit, that I'll be able to get the maximum incentives by doing my project in this state? So what are they looking at? They're going to be looking, number one, typically at your job creation and retention through your jobs. And let's say you are moving from Pennsylvania to Virginia, and you already have employees in Pennsylvania, but you're moving them to Virginia. A lot of times I'm told, well, those don't count by my client, but they actually do count, because those jobs, even though you already had them hired in Pennsylvania, you are moving them to Virginia. So they are new jobs for Virginia. So we can make sure all of those count for your new project to help maximize your incentives. They also look at what your capital investment is. What's the cost of the building, your FF&E, what kind of capital expenditures will you be putting into your project? Another consideration is, what's the average annual wage for the jobs? Is it $13 an hour, or is it a higher paying job that you'll be having? Also, will you be providing additional benefits for the employees? They will sometimes look at the community impact of your project. Like, what is your project doing for the community? And then do you need job training, or will you be training some of their local residents in new areas so that they will be able to work at your plant, your facility, or your data center? All of those are important points for the counties, cities, and states in the US. Next slide, please. So how do you do this? It's important. We follow a particular process for our clients in terms of how we put this together, and I'll go into that in the slides, the following slides. There's different areas that we work in, and each project is different. I can say that. Next slide, please. So initially, how do you get started? Let's say now you know your project qualifies, you think the county or city will be interested, you're creating a lot of jobs, you have capital expenditure, but you don't know which state to go to. You don't know where you're going to receive the best incentive, and also where you're going to have the labor supply that you need for your particular jobs. That's important as well, being able to have the necessary labor supply to fulfill the requirements you have for your labor force. So we normally do like an initial review with the client and help suggest several states that might work best for the project, considering that as well as other factors as well. Then we initiate conversations. We bid our deals out and negotiate with the local communities as well as the county and the state. And finally, we select the location for the project. Once we've done that, we begin negotiations on the incentives and the due diligence process. It's really important that you negotiate. There's a performance agreement with the state or the county, and there's many different names. It could be an MOU, it could be a performance agreement. It's really kind of the same thing with a lot of different names in a lot of different states. It's very important that you negotiate that agreement carefully, because that's the agreement you're going to have to live with the next 3 or 5 years. And you want to make sure that no matter what happens, you have yourself guarded as much as possible down the road as you continue to expand, or your company continues to grow, or if there's a rainy day, that you are protected for that circumstance as well. Next slide, please. So what are some of the areas that our clients look at deciding on which site they're going to go to? I thought this might be of interest to you. Obviously, we look at the economic incentives and who's going to give them the most incentives, but that's not the only thing that they look at. They also look at what states are going to be tech friendly to our business, for our clients that have a great business client that are going to be welcoming them. They look at, many of them need a large number of acres, so you can't necessarily go in the middle of New York City for that, obviously, so we have to look at other locations. They'll look at the electrical providers, power capacity, special zoning. Sometimes our clients that have manufacturers might hit certain noise levels that might exceed, or they certain height limits that are beyond what's allowed from a zoning point of view. So we have to look at all of those factors. We look at the risk factors. Are you in an area where there might be a hurricane, earthquake, floodplains, all of that, tornadoes? They look at that in terms of their facility. They want to look at water and sewer provider capacity, as well as particular interest in the particular site that they're looking at. Those are just a few of the things that we look at for these sites. Next slide, please. We also look at, to make sure that it's an attractive regulatory and tax regime there. There's, like we talked about, there's availability of abundant local supply for various facilities if they need feedstock. There's accessible utilities, that's important as well, and that the workforce in the area is skilled enough. And then if perhaps you're looking at that, frequently our clients will also look at what are the local universities, colleges, and community colleges in a 35-mile radius around where the facility will be. Sometimes they want to work with them to help train their future employees. I know Volkswagen did a deal with local college in Tennessee to help train, spent a lot of money on that to help train employees for their plant in Tennessee and Chattanooga. So that's becoming more common as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the actual site that we're looking at, whether you're going to build from the ground up or you're buying a building that's already there and you're going to convert it to, let's say you're buying an old plant and you're going to convert it as a manufacturing facility or a distribution center or fulfillment center for your project. These are some of the things that you want to look at to be careful that you're selecting the right building or the right site. So we look at everything from environmental, do perhaps a phase 1 or a phase 2 if necessary to make sure the site isn't contaminated. If it does have some issues, what would the cost be to remediate that site? Because it might, if it's near a city, it might have some issues. I mean, it could as well rurally, but we're careful to look at that. You want to look at the topography to see if that will work for your particular project. Is it a wetlands area? Geotechnical, like what's the consistency of the soil? If it's like a high impact manufacturing facility, super important to make sure that if there's going to be a lot of vibrations, that can be handled by the soil that will be underneath the building. Are there endangered species, whether it's flowers or birds or bats around your facility that we need to worry about? What's the zoning? Is the site pad ready, meaning they've already put the infrastructure in and you're kind of ready to go? That can be important if you have a tight timeline. And then what are some of the setbacks and height limitations with a particular site that you're looking at? So an important factor when you're looking at these sites, we ask right up front is, what is your timing? Do you need to be, does your plant, is this on a tight timeline? Do you need to move quickly and get your site? Because let's say you already have contracts from automobile companies and you just need to fulfill them and you have a really tight timeline, which happens, then we know we need to find a pad ready site if you're going to be building. If your timeline is even tighter than that, where you can't build, then we got to find a building that we can convert and make it so that you could use it as a facility. And that's another consideration. So all those things are really important to go with the timing for your particular facility, whether it's a data center, manufacturing facility, or a stadium type project. Next slide, please. These are some of the issues that we talked about. A few more. These are a little bit more of details for you. Like you also want to look at probably fiber optic cables, communication capabilities. What about stormwater? What about the roadway? Is there an egress? Is there an ingress, egress? Rail, are there rail line options? Let's say you want to go somewhere and you need an option. You need a rail, and there's a rail line that's near, but you need a rail spur to be able to use it for your facility. We've often been able to get the local community to give us a rail spur for the projects if we're creating enough jobs and they're interested in our projects. What is the local community support for your project, and what's the local government support as well? Also, what are future opportunities? Let's say you want to build, this is phase 1 for your facility, your manufacturing facility. but you're thinking you might want to do a phase 2 and phase 3. We get that a lot. That's really important when selecting a site. Then you need to make sure that that site you're selecting has an adjacent site that you could buy or have an option to purchase or a right of first refusal, so that you're not landlocked when you need to expand. And that's not an infrequent request that we get for clients looking for new sites for their facilities. Next slide, please. So one thing to know, and you may or may not know this, but some states are particularly attractive, particular type of industries, are really looking to attract particular type of industries more than other states. And this is a very small example. We could go on for pages with this, but as you probably know, Virginia has huge draw in Ashburn, in Loudoun for data centers. Utah particularly likes aerospace. Arizona, large semiconductor fabs are there. Tennessee and Texas particularly like manufacturing. Alabama seems to be attracting a lot of the auto part manufacturing clients as well as others. New York, a lot of distribution centers. This is just to give you a little bit of an idea of that different states can attract different types of businesses or be particularly interested in particular types of businesses. And when they are, that means usually more incentives for you and your company because they're particularly interested in your type of technology or your type of business. So that's why that's important to you. Next slide, please. So what about data centers? As we just talked about, as you probably know, Virginia is the location in the US with the largest assemblage of data centers in the world. Virginia alone, and we've worked on many data center projects in Northern Virginia, as well as on the eastern side of Virginia. There's over 100 data centers with which total more than 13.5 million square feet of data centers in Northern Virginia right now. In fact, 25% of the US hyperscale data centers are located in Northern Virginia outside of Washington, DC. 70% of the internet IP traffic is either created or passed through Loudoun County or Ashburn. And because of that, there's generous state and local incentives in Virginia for data centers coming there. It's we've worked there a lot. It's a very friendly business environment. Another thing that's attractive to our clients, there is a low chance of a natural disaster there, unlike some other states, which they prefer Virginia due to that. And there's also affordable electrical power, water, and wastewater removal in Northern Virginia as well. And there's many other states now as well that are interested in attracting data centers. Next slide, please. What about distribution centers? These are some examples of where distribution centers are going. And they're Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Detroit, Houston, just a few selected locations where, but we're working on a lot of distribution centers, as you could imagine, with all the internet now, retail, the distribution center, there's a lot of distribution centers going up or buildings being converted. Some clients are converting old malls into the distribution centers or fulfillment centers if there's not enough buildings out there that are available and they don't have time for constructing new buildings. Next slide, please. Sorry, next. Yeah, there you go. Thanks. So what about manufacturing? Manufacturing facilities are thriving in the US right now. Really, I think our industrial real estate is really, it's been said that's the way out of the recession in the United States. And so it is definitely thriving in some states. It's definitely a seller's market for those that have buildings for sale for manufacturing, which I know is surprising to many people, but that's the case in many states. So just to give you an idea of a small facility versus mid-size, large sites, some of the areas where there is a lot of manufacturing facilities going, but we're seeing it all over, really, just all over And sometimes it's a race to find the building with the right heights, ceiling height limitations, and the right acreage and the right zoning for our clients so that they can meet their timelines. Next slide, please. So I'm frequently asked, what about the fact that COVID is here? Are they still giving out incentives? What's happened as a result of COVID being here? Well, I can tell you that because economic incentives are spurring job development and furthering creation of new jobs, we've seen no slowdown, in fact, an increase of those coming and trying to receive and receiving incentives during the COVID process. So that has not held us back at all. And some of the concerns have been that there's been government mandated closure, supply chain challenges, corporate cost cutting, and social distancing. So a lot of times these incentives have been able to make up the difference for companies so they can go forward and continue, particularly in the manufacturing, distribution, and fulfillment and data center arenas. They can keep going and keep growing during COVID. Next slide, please. Data centers, they have a lot of data centers, as you can imagine. The demand has increased with all the shopping, with the internet, and so as well as the need with people working at home. As you know, they've forced data centers to increase efficiency, speed, and security with ideals such as modular construction and with prefabricated walls. Companies can purchase more capable servers with this decreased rent by using the modular construction. So they've looked at different ways to create data centers in light of what has happened during COVID. Next slide, please. So there's been a surge, like we're talking about, a surge in internet traffic. So that's created the need for more data centers. There's more Zoom calls, there's more telemedicine, more online shopping, increased data usage, more gaming online, more movies online, and more Netflix. All of that leads to more data centers. Next slide, please. So the US for manufacturing is the largest in the world. We produce 18.2% of the world's goods right now, more than the entire economic output of Canada, Korea, or Mexico. Just behind is China with its low-cost factories. They manufacture about 17.6% of the world's products. So, and during COVID, particular products were, as you know, were in high demand that also required new facilities for manufacturing different things, everything from hand sanitizers, ventilators, PPE equipment, forced companies to set up new facilities or to convert those that they had to supply different products. Next slide, please. Because manufacturing has been expanding, there has been, it seems, a demand for reshoring of facilities back to the US. So there's been advanced manufacturing technology as well, such as 3D printing or next-gen manufacturing equipment. So they've been accelerating with US manufacturing investment and reshoring efforts in the US. We've seen many companies from abroad now decide to put their plant or more plants into the US in the last couple of years, which is really, really interesting. Next slide, please. A lot of our clients, as you could imagine, from everything from distribution centers to manufacturing facilities and auto plants are all using robotics now in their facilities, which is reducing the amount of labor they need. It's creating efficiencies for them as well. Next slide, please. You want to make sure when you go forward and you obtain, let's say you receive your maximum incentives, you want to make sure you have an attorney to review and negotiate with the state city. You want to make sure they review the incentive agreements. We always check the clawback provisions, how long do they last, who do they apply to, and what percentage would they apply to. You want to look at force majeure clauses. Is COVID considered force majeure in your contract, or is it not? It probably should be. If not, what about future pandemics? All of those things are things that you should look at, and look at definitions and finding issues with these MOUs. I can't tell you how important that is. That will prevent you from getting into trouble years down the road by following this advice. Next slide, please. Some of the other issues you can get into are audit concerns, confidentiality. Are they allowed to talk to the press? Who's allowed to talk to the press? You probably want to keep your project very quiet because you don't want to lose employees that you currently have if they hear you're going to be moving. That's an issue we work with on a weekly basis. So you want to be careful with confidentiality agreements. What about post-compliance reporting, all of that? What about landlord-tenant issues? If you've got landlord-tenant, who gets credit for the new jobs and who gets credit for the capital expenditures with the incentives? These are some of the more complex issues we deal with on a weekly basis with our agreements with the states, county, or cities. Next slide, please. You want to make sure you understand force majeure and that you've taken care of pandemics and the coronavirus in your contracts. You want to make sure that you're not, a lot of people had looked at the issue, they had to hire so many new employees, that was part of their agreements. And if they had not had a lawyer review it and didn't have coronavirus as a force majeure, they could get into issues and get into clawbacks if they could not continue to hire new employees during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So there's multiple phases to your project that we've only talked about really economic incentives and a little bit about real estate. Other issues, though, if there was more time, we would talk about finance, corporate and commercial, like where do you set up your entity, which state do you set up your LLC, where should you qualify to do business? What about tax and accounting rules? What about lobbying, public policy? We talked about site selection a little bit, zoning a tiny bit, as well as environmental. So really spend a lot of time on each of these issues for our site selection decisions. Next slide, please. One last thing is opportunity zones. You may have heard about that or read about that. They had slowed down quite a bit the use of them during COVID, but they're coming back now, particularly with real estate projects. So if you select a site, you may want to ask, is it an opportunity zone? If you have an interest in that, because you might be able to receive more equity into your project at a lower cost than if it wasn't in an opportunity zone. So just wanted to mention that because the investors will receive tax benefits for investing into a project that's in an opportunity zone, assuming it meets all the other requirements. And that would be a whole nother topic, but I just wanted to mention that. Next slide, please. So the many projects did stall, but we're seeing them coming back, particularly the real estate projects, not as much the corporate projects right now. But that's something, and I also want to mention, if you are coming in from abroad and will bringing products to America, and you'll be shipping as part of the equipment to manufacture your products, you also want to look to see if your site is a federal trade zone or not. You may want to look into that for duty deferral purposes, or if it's you're shipping your products in the end right back out of the country, it could also be elimination of the duties for your projects. So just that's another thing you want to look at. Next slide, please. Great. Good. Pretty much on time. Thank you.
Olivia, that is fantastic. What a great view of an area that I think that most of our audience does not have a very good grasp on, and it's so important. I say this loosely because there are so many people with us that may have expertise in this area, but I think for the larger portion of our audience, they don't have the insights that you have just shared here. Incredibly useful and practical insights. Tamara, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing the screen right now, and I'm going to come back on with Olivia for the Q&A. So there are a number of themes, Olivia. First of all, lots of comments, and thank you for the presentation. Very insightful, very interesting to see these different aspects that some of our practitioners are not normally aware of. Now, for those who in the audience who knew more about the topic, there are some more incisive questions. A lot of the general questions you answer very well during your presentation, so I'm skipping through those. I'm going to ask some very specific questions on that at least I did not see in your presentation explicitly.
Okay.
Company size. How big do you have to be part of the conversation? Because some of the commentary and assumptions that, well, you know, I'm too small to have a meeting with someone in government to start talking about incentives, right? So at what size of company? Is it a number of employees? Is that revenue level? And what's the size of the infrastructure project itself? At what point it becomes, you know, you become a player that could be eligible for this type of benefits?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So remember, there's two main things they look at: number of jobs and capital investment. So if your project is capital intensive, like we've done on quite a few refineries, biorefineries, where there's heavy capital investment, meaning over $250 million, then they've qualified for very large incentives, and they might only have 24 new employees working there, but they had heavy capital expenditures, so they allowed the lower new job count as a result. So there's just not like any one answer. Where other headquarters projects, so they're not going to have a huge capital expenditure, but maybe you're going to hire 55 new employees. So you're able to qualify because generally in quite a few states, you get a lot more benefit if you hire at least 50 employees. And if you're doing a headquarters project and you're only hiring 10 employees, it's unlikely in most states, I won't say everywhere, but in most states, that you're really going to be getting many incentives. Again, it's driven by the state, but that kind of gives you a flavor that you look at both capital expenditures and jobs, really depending though on the state, if that's helpful.
That's very helpful. You mentioned, you know, of course, like most everything, it depends on a number of factors, but you provided some guidelines there that were interesting, I think, in terms of number of employees and maybe some level of investment. That's very helpful. Another question that has the surface has to do with outbound services, if you will. I know the presentation that you had here was a bit US centric, which is probably about 70% of our audience today, but we have about 30% that is outside of the US. And the question is whether the services can be provided to a foreign organization coming to the US, or the other way around for any organization that's maybe a US-based organization looking to go to free trade zones abroad and doing, you know, establishing their infrastructure abroad.
Yeah, so I'm glad they asked that. So yeah, a large percentage of our clients are from abroad, from either Asia or Europe, coming into the US to bring their factories. And yeah, they absolutely do qualify. Typically, we have to set up a company, either an LLC, maybe in Delaware somewhere, and get them set up, whether they're coming in from Taiwan, Korea, Germany, wherever. We have a company set up in the US to be able to receive the incentives for them. So there's a procedure you have to follow, but they absolutely qualify. In fact, that's encouraged, and states are very excited about the opportunity of bringing business or new business into the United States from abroad. So that's highly encouraged. And then there's also, you're talking about going the other direction. So let's say someone wants to go to abroad. That would not, I don't have specifics on that because we have 56 offices around the world. So those offices would handle those issues. But if you're going into wherever it is, whether it's Asia or Europe, there's different things that I know those clients are looking at to help them set up their facilities. But we would work with our European or Asian offices on that.
That's fantastic. And one of the comments that you just made there about your offices outside of the United States, that was part of the commentary as well. Maybe you can explore that a little bit further for us. Tell us a little bit more about your firm and you know, how many employees you have, and you mentioned offices abroad, which is probably more than what our audience expected. If you could give us some general guidance on the size of the firm and the presence that you have.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I'm a partner at KO Gates, and I spearhead or run the economic development site location practice in the US. And we have offices, like I talked about, all over the world, everywhere from Beijing, Tokyo, Australia, South America, all over Europe, Korea. We have a nice office in Seoul, Korea. So with that, I think we're the 9th or 10th largest law firm in the world. And from that, it's really helpful because we do have a lot of clients coming from Asia and or Korea or Taiwan. And because of that, it's very helpful to have other colleagues in my office that can help interpret because there are cultural differences, and there's some of them speak foreign languages. So it's, you know, I have colleagues when I'm working with our Korean clients that will get on the line and can also help with conversations if foreign languages are involved. So with that, we have a large practice in this area, since we're able to help find the sites and then bring the legal and kind of the business aspects to what people are looking for.
Very well. And you mentioned also during your presentation that there is kind of a preparation before you decided to go into a location and, you know, get a site or start hiring employees. You have to do some of the planning ahead of time, of course. And I know that this will be one of those "it depends" answers, but in general terms, what is the typical timeline that you need to evaluate incentives? If you decide that I'm moving to a certain location in the United States, as an example, I have a target location, or maybe before that, I don't know what my target location is, and I want to evaluate that, and I want, then once I identify the target location, I want to prepare for exploring the incentives. What types of timelines you should be looking at in advance to start that process?
You should start as early as possible. Again, you must start before that lease or LOI or purchase agreement is signed. So for our process, we send out what's called an intake sheet, like immediately, depending on the particular, whether you're a data center or manufacturing, we have different intake sheets, and look at that and evaluate that and what your timing is. In that process of receiving an intake sheet, can take a couple of weeks, go through that material, then start discussing site locations, and then again, put a timeline together from day one to the end and how we're going to, then we back into all the steps, because it's most important to be able to reach that deadline that the client has. So that timeline really helps us figure out how much time do we have to find a site, and things like you talked about. Do we have time to build, or do we have to just find a building that's already existing and use that because we don't have time? So all of those things are reevaluated, and it really varies. And we have clients coming in right now saying they've got contracts, they just need somewhere to manufacture so they can meet their contracts, and they don't give us a lot of time. We have to work with that. We have others that have maybe 12 months, others that have 16 months. So I've seen all different types of timeline, but I would suggest that you start as early as possible with this process.
That's very good guidance. And the last question we have here is a bit more of a curiosity question. Kind of hot spots in the United States right now in terms of this movement of businesses that you may be observing. Of course, you know, I'm in San Antonio, just outside of Austin, Texas, and Austin has been booming with corporate relocations. I can probably think right off the top of my head, HP and Oracle, Tesla, Apple, all building significantly in the Austin area and in the you know, in nearby. Just out of curiosity, are there other hotspots around the country right now that are kind of attracting that type of movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there's a lot of areas that are hotspots that we're working in right now. Phoenix, Arizona is a big hotspot for technology, semiconductor companies, as well as others. And then the whole South for manufacturing. In fact, in some states, they are so busy now, it's hard to find buildings that are already built, ready to go, over 300,000 square feet. So the South is just booming in the industrial area. Data centers, obviously, in Virginia continue to boom, as well as in Indiana, Illinois, and then all over distribution centers, trying to find facilities, including Texas, your state. We just did a large distribution center in Texas. So the industrial world is booming. There's not really much written about that right now, but we can tell you from our searches for all these different types of buildings and locations that it's definitely booming.
Olivia, on behalf of our global audience, I want to say thank you for taking the time and sharing your expertise with us. Very practical insights and incredibly useful insights for all of us, and we appreciate that.
Great, thank you very much. And we're going to turn our PowerPoint as a handout for anybody who didn't get to see this or would like to review some of the information. So thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Very generous of you. Thank you. That ladies and gentlemen, Olivia Byrne here with K&L Gates. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And this brings us to the final session and day of the IT Infrastructure and Cloud Strategies Live. I want to first of all thank all of you for being with us through this 3-day event. All of you who are here in person and live and engage and ask questions, which is fantastic. But also those of you who are going to be watching these recordings and are going to be consuming these presentations via the recordings. Of course, we want to thank all of our speakers and global cross-industry leaders for taking the time of their very busy schedules to share their expertise and insights with all of us. And this goes without saying that none of this would happen without a great team behind the scenes. And a great leader like Brian Raffel, who is our conference director, who makes it all work in connecting all of these great people and ideas to bring you a world-class event. Also, Vijay Bajaj, the CEO of Proqis Digital, for his vision and execution during times of uncertainty and rapid change. And for LeanIX, our sponsor, who has made this possible and accessible to all of you at no cost through their generosity and sponsorship. So we're deeply grateful to all of these great leaders and organizations who have made this happen. I want to remind you that if you want to capture the benefits of being a registered participant in our next event, make sure you register. We have a limited registration that's capped at 3,000, and you have to register that by looking up BTOES Digital Process Automation Live. BTOES Digital Process Automation Live. We have sent links during the presentations, but if you have missed those links, just do a search under that and you'll find the next conference that will take place May 11th through 13th. In the meantime, I'm going to be posting an update on today's presentations on LinkedIn under my name, José Pires. So please go there. If you can add to the conversation, ask a question to the speakers, thank them for sharing their wisdom and engaging on the conversation post-conference. The posting is going to be there and you're going to see what others have said. And I will post an update a little bit later on today. On behalf of the entire team at Proqis Digital, we want to thank you again for being here with us, and we hope to see you on May 11th through 13th on Digital Process Automation Live. Whatever you are in the world, have a great rest of your day and have a great rest of your week.